Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth live chat in the 2022 series about the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships Program, also known as STPF. I'm glad you are joining us for today's chat. My name is Vanessa Furtado, and I am one of the program managers here at STPF. I will be your moderator for today's chat. The live chat series is designed for you, or fellowship applicants. If you're applying now or in the future, this series is an opportunity for you to learn about STPF and the application and interview process directly from fellows. To put today's session in context, we are hosting one chat each month during the application season, June through October. We hope you will join us for all that sound interesting to you. Each month's chat will focus on a unique aspect of the fellowship experience, meant to answer questions from applicants. And each chat will feature a different panel of fellows. In a moment, you'll hear from today's panelists, Shoko, Vince, and Anna. Today's chat topic is all about you. We'll begin with a quick STPF application walkthrough before diving into your questions with our panelists, Anna, Vince, and Shoko. As fellows who have gone through the STPF application and interview process recently, they'll have advice and insights to share with you. You'll leave today's chat with a better understanding of what to expect from the application and interview process. Speaking of applications, STPF is currently accepting applications through November 1st. These fellowships are an opportunity for doctoral level scientists, social scientists, and engineers to spend a year contributing their expertise to federal policy. They are a paid 1-year full-time commitment in Washington, D.C. Someone who applies by this year's deadline will be considered for a position in the fellowship class that begins next fall. So I'm curious, do you plan to apply? In a moment, you'll see a poll pop up on your screen. Please click the response that best matches with your plans. And thanks to everyone who's answering the poll. We'll give you a few more seconds to reply. I think here are the results. Well, fantastic. Thank you all for being here. For those applying or thinking about applying this year, we're so glad that you are here. This session was designed with you in mind. We hope you leave with a deeper understanding of the application and interview questions. For those of you who may be a few years away from applying, it's great that you're here too, as you'll hear advice from our panelists that you can keep in your mind as you consider STPF in your career path. And for those who aren't sure, we're thankful you're sharing your time with us to learn more about STPF. Since so many of you are planning to apply now or in the future, I'd like to share an overview of the STPF application. It contains 8 steps, beginning with the eligibility self-check. Wondering if you are eligible to apply this year? Visit our application portal. We'll put a link in the chat box now. Next up is step 2, where you'll provide your CV and information about your qualifying degree. In step 3, you'll work with a third-party vendor who helps us verify your eligibility. On to step 4, where you'll select program areas. Applicants can select 2 of 3 program areas: executive, legislative, and judicial. If you're unsure which program areas align with your policy interests, check out the August live chat recording. That chat featured speakers who had served as fellows in Congress, the judiciary, and an executive branch agency. Selecting your program areas unlocks step 5, where you will enter 3 references per program area. Your references will receive automated emails from our system with instructions. And remember, your application deadline is their deadline too. Entering your references will also unlock step 6. This is where you'll respond to essay prompts and select your policy interests. You'll conclude by reviewing your application and hitting submit. We know this was a quick overview, and a more detailed step-by-step application overview can be found on the STPF application portal. We'll put a link in the chat box. Now, let's get to your questions. To submit your questions to the panel, click the question box in your menu, as shown on the screen. When you do, you can indicate the person or people to whom your question is directed. We'll get to as many questions as we can today. Now I'm happy to introduce you to our fellows. Shoko Shimbrat is a second-year fellow in the National Science Foundation's Office of Polar Programs Arctic Division. Shoko is an ecologist and conservation social scientist using impact assessment, science coordination, and science communication approaches to make strides on topics of climate adaptation, conservation economics, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. She earned her PhD in ecology at Colorado State University in the Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources in 2019. Her doctoral research centered on how stewardship and climate adaptation could be fostered through community-based natural resource management, payment for ecosystem services, and citizen science programs in rural and urban Latin America. Welcome, Shoko. Anna Hagstrom is an environmental scientist passionate about policies to advance environmental health and support the clean energy transition. She is beginning her second year as an STPF Fellow in the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, where she works on cross-cutting energy analysis projects in the Office of the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. Anna is also beginning a 50% detail in the Office of the Undersecretary for Science and Innovation, where she will support cross-agency coordination on initiatives related to geothermal energy. Before becoming an STPF Fellow, she was a 2019 Mirzayan Fellow at the National Academies, followed by 2 years as the inaugural Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering Science and Technology Policy Fellow. Anna earned a PhD in Chemical and Environmental Engineering from Yale University. Thanks for joining us, Anna. And finally, Vince Tejasaputra is currently the Director of Scientific Communications at the American Lung Association. Prior to this, he spent 2 years as an STPF Fellow at the National Science Foundation's Office of Legislative and Public Affairs. He is a former college athlete turned exercise physiologist from San Diego, California. He earned a PhD in physical education and recreation from the University of Alberta and a postdoctoral fellowship in pulmonary physiology at the UC San Diego School of Medicine. Welcome, Vince. We're so thankful you can join us today. And before I go to the questions from the audience, I'll kick it off with one. Knowing what you know now, what do you each wish you knew before you applied to STPF? Anna, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm sure I'll think of more as we keep talking, but I think that I wish that I had taken more people up on advice to do practice interviews beforehand. I remember I met a lot of fellows and former fellows on Twitter as I was going through the application process, and there were definitely people who offered to do practice interviews leading up to it. And I think that interviewing is a skill that you build over time, at least in my case. I was very nervous about it beforehand. So I did one short practice right before, and I think that had I done maybe 2, then it would have been less nerve-wracking for me.
Vince?
Wish I'd taken it less of an academic approach. I had mentioned earlier that I had written this application in the midst of grant season, and it was the 8th thing I was writing, and so I was in like show evidence mode. And so I think that had I approached the application a little bit more like holistically, like, I am a person who does science but is also interested in policy and acting at the highest levels of federal government, I would have probably aligned some of my writing a little bit differently. But I got in, so it worked.
Shoko, what about you?
Yeah, I agreed. Just getting feedback on, for instance, both the interview and the application itself kind of gave me some insight in how I could really improve my application. So people who are non-academics, really trying to pull you out of your disciplinary focus and better communicate how you think that you could apply your very specific skills within the fellowship, and thinking about how you could have an impact in translating that science into policy. So yeah, just at every stage, if you have support, really pull on it and try and think bigger, because AAAS really wants to know who you are and how you can apply your skills and knowledge and experience. So
wonderful. Thank you all. I'm now going to some of our questions from our participants, kind of along that same vein. How do I make my application competitive? What advice do you have for writing a great application? And again, would love to hear from all three of you.
I'll jump in. I think that you really want to play to your strengths. So I think you get in a trap a little bit if you've been in academia for a long time and say like, I'm only good at using this microscope or you know, this tool. What could I offer AAAS that would make them want to choose me? I think like if you're really good at making PowerPoint slides, that means you're a great scientific communicator. And in fact, I use that example because that's what I did. I found that I liked to communicate the science more than I actually like doing the science and helping, my lab mates do the same thing. And so that's what I wrote about, because I knew when I would get asked about it in the interview, I could speak from a place that is like from authentic expert, instead of like saying something that I think that they would want to know. And I spent 5 minutes on Wikipedia about it. So play to your strengths and think about new applications of those strengths and skills that you may not have thought of otherwise.
I can add just briefly. I completely agree. Adding, speaking to your strengths and also working a little bit potentially outside of maybe what you're usually writing, your comfort zone. So for me, all of my research had been in Latin America, and I'm like, well, I don't know necessarily very much about, US policy. And so I spent quite a bit of time thinking about like, how would I apply, this agricultural system and policies that might work elsewhere. So in my bio, there was, I study payment for ecosystem services. So how you can pay farmers to not deforest. And the USDA, for example, has a very similar program. And so I talked a little bit about how I could apply the things that I had learned in a different context and in the US policy system. So work to your strengths, but I think you know more than you think that you know. So, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I guess I have similar advice. So I was talking to a friend last week who was interested in applying, and she's a professor and was trying to figure out what to emphasize in her application. And I think we have so many more transferable skills than we realize. I was like, well, like you manage students, like you are inherently a project manager, like emphasize like A, B, C. And she's like, oh, I never thought about it that way. So I feel like a lot of it is just kind of recognizing the skills that you use kind of regularly, but don't necessarily think about in a like non-scientific context. And I guess in the same way, don't forget to like extracurriculars are super important. I think that as scientists, there's the tendency to focus on kind of the technical aspects of what you do during grad school, but I think that what you do outside of the lab, both in terms of the skills you gain during that and just how that kind of fleshes you out as a full person with like varied interests. I think that those are really important things to discuss as well.
Great, thank you. Another question about your backgrounds. What sort of background did you all have in policy prior to applying for this fellowship?
I can quickly jump in. I had almost no policy in the US based experience. So I had kind of a little bit of academic, like how could these conservation programs be applied by decision makers? And, I'd written a couple of papers on that topic, but I was pretty much starting from zero. So, don't be afraid, even if you don't have that experience, to still apply.
Sorry, I had zero experience. Like I served on a committee of my grad student society. That's like the closest thing to like non-academic policy stuff that I did. But again, like, and I felt a little bit intimidated that there were other people applying to the program that were former Marzalian fellows or, at the state level, but really like, the program wants to attract very talented people who don't quite know yet that their skills are very valuable to the U.S. government and beyond. So don't be scared off if you have 0.
Yeah, I was I had kind of a background that I was building on because I had done the Merzion Fellowship a couple years before, right after my PhD. So, I mean, I was basically the way that the end of my PhD lined up, I wasn't eligible to apply to AAAS for that year. So I did the Merzion Fellowship, which is in DC and involves working at the National Academies for 12 weeks. And then I also did a state level fellowship in Connecticut for the 2 years leading up to my time in AAAS. So I think that's got to put a quick plug in for state level fellowships. I think outside of federal level opportunities, there's a lot of states out there that are looking to start their own programs that are kind of modeled after AAAS. And I think that those can also be really great opportunities to get some policy experience.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what do you recommend to someone that has no idea how individual agencies or the US policy system actually work? What are your favorite readings or websites of individual agencies? So where would you point people to start learning?
Find them on LinkedIn. Find people who work there on LinkedIn, especially former fellows, former and current fellows. For the most part, love to talk about themselves, which is why we're here. But we're all helped by people who were in the fellowship formally. So I didn't know a whole lot about the government other than what I hear from CNN during the crazy times a few years ago when I was applying. Then when we came out and did all these interviews and learned so much beyond what we learned in 8th grade civics class. But hearing from the people who were actually doing the work and sort of they're able to give you the information in a filter that you understand as a scientist and how you fit in there. So say whatever you're interested in, whatever agency, go on LinkedIn, just type in that agency, see if you have 2nd or 3rd level connections or ask people to connect you with people. That's the best way to do these short 15, 30-minute informational interviews.
Yeah, I think I'd second that. As academics, I feel like our instinct is to be like, all right, what are the sources I need to read on this? But I think that you can kind of drill to the heart of what working in an agency is like much more quickly when you actually talk to the people who work there.
Anything to add, Shoko?
No, thank you.
Still focusing on the application, did you have parts of your application that you felt were not competitive? For example, your publication record, and if so, how did you go about compensating for it?
I think it would have been nice to know what makes a successful applicant, right? It's like, is it somebody who has 50 papers coming in? If so, how can a postdoc compare to like a professor coming into the program? And then you realize like, well, you're not really applying for a professorship. You're applying to a place where you are a trainee for 2 years in a very intense program. So while I was okay as an applicant, like I had, I don't know, like 20 papers, and in my field, that's just okay for the postdoc level. So I sought to have a more well-rounded application. You know, we had mentioned your extracurriculars matter. Like, you know, I was a singer, I was an athlete. Like all these things gave me confidence to be a public speaker, and so that's why I was interested in science communications. And so being able to tell a much more interesting story than like I have 18 papers, I'm an expert in lung disease or whatever. But there's so many of us. But what makes you stand out is that you're a person that's interested in advancing big S science by jumping into science policy and not the knowledge creation at the bench alone.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that kind of embedded in that question is the norm of what you expect a fellow might look like, which If you go to the AAAS S&T Fellow website, you can see pictures of, you know, it includes everyone from people who are right out of grad school to, you know, at NSF, there are a few people I'm working with who are, you know, in their 60s, and they wanted just to see what it's like to work at NSF. And so they have a massive publication record. And so, yeah, I also was kind of came at it with a fine publication record, but I think if you look at what is required in the application, there's, you know, a lengthy section for extracurricular activities, and that's where I think you can highlight some of the things that maybe in your CV might be lacking. So, yeah.
Yeah, I second what both Shoko and Vince said. I think that as grad students, you're kind of trained to value publications above all else. That's kind of like how your worth is measured. But I think that this is an application where you can showcase yourself on a much more holistic level.
And one more about the application or the stage, the career stage of the applicant. Do you think that a newly graduated PhD is still a competitive applicant?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
PhDs that are in the program. Yeah.
And good for you for realizing to leave academia sooner rather than less of us. Just kidding. Academia is fine.
All right. So now we may go over to references. And I'd like to hear from each of you. There's a question from the audience about how did you each select your 3 references, and how did you support or prepare them to be your reference?
So I can start. I really wanted to choose people who could, you know, kind of with this trend of presenting your holistic self, who could speak to me and my skills throughout my the various periods of my life. So I really wanted, you know, maybe this is obvious, I wanted my advisor to provide a letter of recommendation. I wanted my postdoc supervisor to provide a letter of recommendation, and I'm actually forgetting who my 3rd person was, but for each person, I really provided them exactly with the kind of guidelines, but also with the application and with what I thought they could highlight or underline that I had already said in my application. So yeah.
Similarly, you know, I chose 3 big themes of my application, and I chose my references to each reflect those separately. So I think you may be tempted to be like my PI, my you know, somebody in my lab, another senior PI, and you would do that for a faculty application, but you wouldn't do it here. Mine was my postdoc supervisor because she needed to support my scientific record, which I thought was an important part of the application. But the 2 other references actually met in my choir. You know, one of them was, they're both bassists, and one of them was an environmental lawyer who dropped out of his chem engineering PhD and knew me as like a good communicator. And another one was also a bassist. He founded the School of Public Policy at my university, which I didn't know until I told him I was applying to this program. So helping them help you really helps flesh out their recommendation in a way that makes you shine. So I sent them the full text of my application. So that means that you got to do it soon so they can read it. And I sat down and I talked to them and I said, here's my vision for how I fit into this program based on my history. And here's why I've chosen you, because you know me in this way. You know me, I am a scientist, but you know that I'm more than that. And things that make you a good scientist, make you good at arguing for a certain point or whatever, like you want them to be able to show that in their letter for you.
Yeah. I think I chose my PI, obviously, to back up my science creds. And then I chose the administrator of the state level fellowship program, who I'd gotten to know pretty well. So I didn't work with her on a daily basis, but we would get together regularly and kind of chat about my thoughts on what I was doing, how I could improve and everything. So I thought that she could speak to kind of my motivations. And then I chose my boss, who I'd worked with at the state level, so who I'd worked with on a day-to-day basis. And same sort of thing as Vince and Shoka said, I sent them the application materials that I had. I think it was just a draft of my application. I think my statement got better in the last week or so leading up to it, because I have a bad tendency to leave some things to the last minute, which I would not suggest. But I think I also, again, like Vince and Shoka said, highlighted why I chose them and what skills that I had. I thought that they would be well prepared to speak to. And I also offered to kind of read over their letters and offer edits, and some of them took me up on that.
Great, thank you. So this next question kind of goes right through the application acceptance process, being a fellow. So in all of your experience and with other fellows, would you say most people are able to find full-time positions in agencies after their fellowship ends? Curious about where people go on to work after the fellowship, as someone who wants to work in policy government long-term.
I think it depends.
Everyone gets a job.
Yeah,
everyone gets a job.
I think one of the reasons why I chose Department of Energy is when I was talking to current fellows during the finalist level of the application process, a lot of them had known people who had gotten jobs at DOE afterward. Like, I think that there's different, I think that's more common at some agencies than others. And I liked that DOE was one where if you wanted to get hired, you had a pretty good shot at that. And I would say that that is still true, given that DOE is trying to hire many hundreds of people for all of the funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law at the moment. So quick plug for that.
I'll double up. I say everyone gets a job, but you don't just receive a job at the end of it. Just like how this is a difficult time in your life thinking about pivoting from your career now into a 2-year program that is very accelerated, it'll arm you with the tools and the skills you need to go to the next level. So be comfortable with being uncomfortable. I ended up in a nonprofit at the American Lung Association, the director of scientific communications, and that is, sort of full circle. I ended up at NSF because I didn't want to work at NIH because I was done talking about lung disease, which is what I did in my PhD. And then COVID happened and we became the lung guy anyway. And so you sort of pick up like the different projects throughout your fellowship and the different contexts that you make. You'll start to see like, oh, I like doing this, I don't like doing that. And then eventually you start building out your own sort of dream job. And you hope that a job description floats across your desk that matches that. But a big part of getting a job after the fellowship is the fellows network themselves. So anytime I see any job that is sort of science policy or adjacent, I would send it out to each other. And especially like if you're vocal about the keywords that you like, so my keywords are science communication, lung disease, strategic thinking, strategic planning, people will send me jobs because they know that. So I've spent a little bit of time talking about that. And that's like the real magic sauce of the fellowship. Like the 2 years working is great, but then you get to meet people like this, and we've all had this sort of shared excitement / trauma of like a really huge career transition. So that's something that you have in common with everybody. And like I said, everyone's happy to chat about it.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that most people find something by the end or even before the end of their fellowship. The secret sauce is all of the amazing network of fellows that you're connected to, and the experience of doing this life change and figuring out what you like, what you're good at, and what you want to keep doing. Like Anna said, there are certain agencies that are more likely to hire their fellows than other, and there are certain, internal documents that AAAS fellows share of like how many people have continued in USAID or how many fellows have been hired from NSF. But I guess, you know, different fellows have different outcomes that they're looking for. Some people are just here for, you know, a sabbatical, and so they only want to be in the fellowship for a little bit of time and then back to their institution. And some people want it to try on the policy hat, and you know, like Vince, it's like, okay, I like this, but I'm going to a nonprofit and not going to continue in a federal agency. So it just kind of broadens your perspective on the possibilities that are out there.
Yeah, just seconding that, I think one of the amazing things about being in DC is just the chance to network with people and learn about the breadth of different careers that scientists who transition out of academia take. So I feel like I came into it and I knew kind of a few different career paths, but I feel like I've learned about so many more routes that people take. So I think I didn't know exactly what I wanted coming into it, and I think I've gotten a better and better idea as I've gone through the fellowship.
It is good to think about beyond the 2 years, because the fellowship is not the destination, right? It's just part of the journey. And so even if you are thinking of staying in academia, like going to NIH and shadowing a program officer for 2 years and being in all these grant review sessions and hearing about what is sexy and what is not, what makes a grant funded makes you very dangerous when you write your own grants. Or you want to go on and start a consultancy and help other PIs write grants, you can do that, and you can make a ton of money doing that. So, you know, depending on what your interests are, and they're going to change once you come into the fellowship and beyond. But just know that, you know, it's hard, but like we've all done it. There's over 3,000 fellows who have passed on and everyone has gotten a job. It may not be the Cinderella job where it's like perfect and you get paid a ton of money right out of the bat, but you'll start to see areas where you're good at and you start to advocate yourself for those positions.
Thank you. And actually now I think we're close to 4,000 fellows. And I just wanted to share some other data that we have. In the year immediately following their fellowship, approximately 40 to 50% of fellows continue working in the policy realm, though not necessarily in the federal government. About 20 to 25% return to the sector in which they worked before they came to the fellowship, and about 20 to 25% use this experience as a stepping stone to a new opportunity. So next question for each of you. Curious what your day-to-day activities look like as a fellow.
Say a lot of Teams meetings in my case. Right now, I'm going into the office 1 day a week, and the other 4 I'm working from home. So it's a lot of meetings on various projects, but I think also a lot of time where I get to work on longer term projects that I have going. Like I worked on a report to Congress on heating and cooling emissions from buildings. So that was my first big project that I worked on. And so that was something that I would go back to every time I had finished addressing like short-term requests that came up. So I think one of the things that I liked is that there's variety from day to day. You never quite knew exactly what you were going to do at 9 a.m. when you showed up. And after my PhD, I was looking for something like that.
I would echo that I go to way more meetings than I ever went to when I was in academia. Agencies differ in their norms, but at least at NSF, you know, everything is very democratic. And, you know, I, for instance, today had a meeting about a meeting that was to brief someone about another meeting. So it was like 3 meetings deep. Like, so anyways, so, you know, but it's not all meetings, you know, you're working on a really wide, or at least I work on a really wide variety of tasks with a lot of different people. And that is partially by design, partially because, you know, I want to get a wide variety of experiences, partially because this is like a professional development opportunity. And so my supervisor is also keeping an eye out for like, okay, well, you know, you've gotten this experience, maybe you should, yeah, like write a report to Congress, or maybe you should, I just had an opportunity come across my desk to do some work with the Bering Sea Task Force. I write monthly news stories from time to time. I help with selecting reviewers, and you know, some stuff is more sexy and exciting than others, but it is interesting to see behind the scenes, at least at NSF, how funding gets done. So
Yeah, it's so different between every fellow and every day. So it's hard for me to say like, what's a typical day? So, you know, if you are working at state or at aid, you may be traveling to Africa 3 times a year, 4 times a year, and that's pretty exciting. If you're working, you know, at crisis management, you may be getting 10,000 emails a day, which is real. You know, what I did at the Office of Legislative and Public Affairs depended on the project. So we would put on a lot of events. So, you know, we did a Women in STEM event at Alexandria City High School, which was a FLOTUS initiative. Got to travel a little bit, did a lot of writing, but it really depends on what your projects are. You know, speaking of other opportunities, like I got the opportunity to help write the NSF 5-year strategic plan, which is very cool because that gave me an opportunity to learn about how these priorities are shaped, what are the conversations and debates that happen at the highest levels of an agency, how to take into context what is happening around the world, not just within our own government, but you know, priorities with climate change and budget issues. You know, those are skills that I took into my next job. So it really differs, and I think that's the point. It differs. Although the 9 to 5 is great, I will say. They're more amenable to being like, don't email me on Saturday at 10 p.m. Like, what are you doing? There's, in my experience, I put an end to that. So you have an opportunity to reinvent what your daily life looks like in this fellowship.
Yeah, if work-life balance is important to you, you can actually make that happen.
That's great, thank you. So now we have a question about the finalist interview stage. If we are fortunate to advance to the final rounds of the application, what advice do you have for matching with particular agencies and roles?
I think that I was really intimidated at first by that stage of the process, but everyone gave me advice that I should have taken, that once you reach the finalist stage, like, offices want fellows. Like, there are far more openings for fellows than there are finalists. So I know my office tried to get a fellow this year and did not succeed. So it was, I mean, different offices had different styles of interviewing, but I had so many interviews where I jumped onto the meeting and they were trying to essentially sell me on their office. So I would say also, like, look through all of the descriptions that are posted on which offices are looking for fellows, because at the beginning of the week, you'll automatically be, well, not automatically, you'll likely be assigned a few interviews with offices that kind of looked at your application and thought, oh, like, this person might be a good fit. But at the end of the day, all of the offices that I ultimately ended up considering really highly were ones where they hadn't reached out to me originally, but I looked at the description, thought I could be a good fit for this, and reached out to ask them for an interview. And like, so I would say definitely taking initiative like that is really important.
It's definitely a two-way interview. As you say, it's like, I started my first interview sort of boldly, and I said, "Could I start with a question? Why did you want to interview me?" And I think like they were delighted they would ask me that I would ask that, because some places will say like, "Oh, this person has this keywords, and we need to fill that gap." But other people, they see something in your application that you wrote but didn't really realize was like the strength, and so that fit between offices and the fellow is so important. The fit between you and your future mentor is really important as well. And so interview a lot, And then I think this might be, I don't know if they're doing in-person interviews again or coming back to it, but making friends with your fellow finalists, it's really important. At first, you'll sit down in this big room and you're like, everybody's so smart and I'm competing with all these people for these jobs. But there's not one job. There's one job for you and there's one job for Anna and one job for Shoko. Like, so keep an open mind, and these will be your friends and not your competitors. And be proud of yourselves that you're sort of in this really great company of really smart people who want to change the world. But interview week's so fun. It's so exhausting. Nobody wants to do it again, although some people do. But it's just like, I haven't been in DC since I was like in eighth grade, and like take the metro from NIH to NSF in the same day for an interview. Like, this is really far if you don't know about that. But it's a lot of fun, and it's really nice to debrief with your friends at the bar afterwards. So take advantage of that early networking.
I think most things have been said. I did interview week online, so it was a little bit different. But yeah, interview week, I had 13 different interviews that were half-hour long meetings. It was stressful. So imagining going from NIH to NSF, and buffering in an hour and a half, it's a whirlwind. And because you really only have like a week in advance to prepare, that means that you kind of can't, with 13 interviews, you can't really stress too much about preparing for everything. But just make sure with every interview, the most obvious question is, why do you want this job? And so, ask yourself that as well. But for most of the interviews, I kind of wish that I had taken Vince's tact of like, why did you want this job? It's like, well, you asked me for an interview, so why did you want me? But I was never so bold.
Yeah, I wasn't either. I also did it online. And I would say, like Vince said, it is a two-way interview. So I certainly didn't march in there and ask them questions that were that bold, but I think that you have to ask, like, you have to go in kind of knowing what you're hoping to get out of the fellowship experience and really ask if, like, figure out whether that office is able to provide what you want. Like, what is the office culture? Who would your mentor be? Like, are they supportive of professional development? Really think of all those questions, and don't just go in prepared to interview them based on like what you're hoping to get out of your experience.
So one more thing I will add is some of these job descriptions require a clearance, security clearance. So you can consider what that means depending on where you live or your travel history or any illegal or now legal drug use that you might be partaking in now, because by the time you apply for a job later, those things will come into focus. So it's important to know at least a year ahead of time here that those are things that you need to look at.
Yeah, in my case, I knew I wanted a job right away because my previous job had ended a couple months before that. So I wasn't in a postdoc where I could just kind of stick around and wait for clearance. So I did kind of an interview at State and an interview at USAID where I would need clearances because I was curious, but I think I mostly focused on positions where I would not need like secret or top secret clearance because that can take a while.
Wonderful, thank you. And I just want to clear up, I nodded enthusiastically when Vince asked if we were doing interviews in person. We just did our first orientation in person for the first time in 2 years, but I think we are rolling out our programming event by event moving forward using both virtual and in person to make sure we're making the best that we can. So that may be TBD. I just wanted to clear up my nod there. A question, perhaps it was inspired by something Anna said, but I think you can all answer it. Anna mentioned state-sponsored fellowships for those that may have a timing issue between getting your PhD and actually being able to apply. Any other advice for a student finishing up their program, but who will not be done before the application deadline?
Yeah. I mean, that is why I initially applied to kind of my state level fellowships, because there's a bunch of different fellowships and they all have slightly different timelines. So some of them are a few months long, some of them are a year long. In my case, mine was 2 years long. I can certainly pass along resources on kind of where on all the different fellowship opportunities. I don't have them all memorized. I think there used to be 8 states that had fellowships. Now we're way higher than that, so I've completely lost track.
If you have a time gap and you're thinking about your application in the future, you might as well make your application better now. So if you're worried that you don't have any policy experience, and again, I don't think you need any to get in, you think about how your work could have potential policy implications. So for example, I studied, I was an exercise physiologist that studied how the heart and lungs work together during exercise in people with mild COPD or mild lung disease. So my data showed that people who are mildly sick are actually way sicker than they are labeled as. And that has a policy implication because Medicare does not cover mild COPD, pulmonary rehab, only moderate and severe. They may have changed by now, but there was like data that showed that this agency should change their policies, right? But nobody was talking about it in my circle. And it's not like somebody is just trolling the internet looking for data and well, maybe a fellow in the future. But if you have an idea of how you can apply your data now, you should think about how that can be done, and might have a great story to write in your application in a few months.
Great. Shoko, anything to add?
No.
Wonderful. All right. A question for each of you. Why did you choose the executive branch over legislative or judicial?
I applied to both legislative and executive. I didn't get into both, so I didn't choose. But I believe that AAAS hosts 2 legislative fellowships, and about 30 other partner societies do, over 30. But there are just more openings in the executive branch. And yeah, I didn't have a choice, so.
I only applied to executive branch, so I had worked in the executive branch at the state level in Connecticut, and I liked the balance that gave me between being able to like dive in terms of some depth on specific topics, along with like shorter fire drill things. I think that from talking to my friends who are congressional fellows, like the pace is much faster, and you're expected to kind of be able to work on a much broader range of topics. And so I think that executive branch kind of fit what I was looking to get out of the fellowship a little bit better, but I think you'd have a great experience in any of them.
Yeah, so I started to create a application both for executive and legislative, and did a little bit more, fact finding and gathering of data, and just to like hear about what other people's experiences have been. So both of my cousins and actually my uncle were AAAS fellows, so I called on them to, yes, we have a family of fellows, and yeah, just to hear, what their experiences were, and what I wanted to get out of it. And I wanted something that was less fast-paced than, going to the Hill and getting briefed on every single thing on, health or environment. And I would just kind of envisioned myself of like, where do I want to go? And I had kind of this list of agencies like USGS, NSF, and it's like, well, why would I circuitously go to a congressional, there are reasons for doing that, but for me, it's like, if I want to work with NSF, why would I work someplace else first? So that was my rationale.
I would have loved to do a congressional fellowship, and I still might in the future. I love the networking aspect of like, oh, this person needs an answer on this question. I actually know a person connecting them, and I love doing that matchmaker stuff. And I think like the fast pace and working on a lot of different things really feeds the adrenaline part of me. So if that speaks to you as a person, or you want to work on things that are emergent and on fire, literally and figuratively, apply to a congressional fellowship. It's awesome.
All right, so now a question about your CV. The CV is supposed to complement your statements, but it feels weird taking out my extracurriculars, like science policy experience or advocacy experience from my CV. Do you have any advice?
Don't take it out. I didn't know that was a thing. Was it?
I think I remember them talking about trying not to like be redundant between your CV and application. But I mean, in a CV, you're not going to provide as much detail, and you can provide details on things that you don't have time to mention in your application. So I mean, I wouldn't stress out about that too much. I think you can still, I wouldn't take those experiences out of your CV entirely. Leave them in there. Maybe just don't provide like extreme levels of detail like you did in your statement.
Yeah, I would agree. I think just leave them in, but don't go into the level of detail that you're obviously going to have like half a page or whatever for your application to detail. So.
Thank you. And back to the fellowship, how often are you asked to work outside of your academic field, and how can you best adapt?
Well, until COVID, it was 100% of the time. I was happy not talking about lung disease for like the first 6 months of my fellowship. But it goes back to like the skills that you have as a PhD. Like you're a researcher, which means like if you're looking for, even at home, you're like, oh, one of these new shoes, and you read like all these reviews on it. You do the same thing for issues in policy. So, like you're a very good researcher. So, made me do quick Google searches on how like black holes are formed and how they're imaged, and that's one big thing that we did at NSF was did a big press release on the first image of the black hole. That was big. So broadening your knowledge base using your ability to like really narrowly search down stuff. I was working outside of me all the time.
Yeah, I think I purposely sought out an office that did not exactly line up with my technical expertise going into it, because I wanted to broaden. Most of my previous research and work had been focused on my previous job had been focused on like environmental cleanup. So I switched from that to clean energy, which it used a little bit of knowledge from my PhD, but really the vast majority of it is brand new to me. And so I just started a new detail in the Undersecretary's office at DOE, and I'm now in charge of their subsurface portfolio. So a lot of geothermal energy, some critical materials and mining work, and I know very little about any of that. So I've set up weekly meetings with some subject matter experts in the agency because I think talking to people who know about what you're working on, like I said before, is one of the more efficient ways to like figure out what the important things to know are. Like, so I will obviously do a lot of reading, but I didn't want to dive right in and just like go to the internet and figure it out. I was like, all right, guys, what are the important things that I need to know? Like, where should I focus my research? So that's at least what I'm trying. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, so my background, like I said, I worked in social ecological spaces in Latin America, and I now work in the Arctic section. So a lot of, it's just a very different place, and it's kind of more about the transferable skills that you bring in from your PhD, like, going to the literature, going to, experts, and using your skills just in a different way. And I think being a fellow kind of allows you this grace of people don't expect you to know everything, which is really nice. You can ask, questions that you might not be able to ask regularly, like, well, since, this is my first time thinking about this subject, X, Y, and Z. And you'd actually be surprised how many people, you meet at meetings of like, oh, I'm a AAAS fellow too. So there's a whole network of people who have been exactly where, I've been, who are like, okay, I understand why you're asking these questions. So you're not expected to know everything, but see it as an opportunity to learn new things. So
Having the PhD itself is a subject matter expertise. Like at NSF, we're talking to professors and stuff all the time, and so like being a PhD means that you're in the PhD club, and that like you understand what it's like culturally, the lab level, right? And so that actually goes a long way. Part of my work in my office was like, well, what's it like to submit a grant? And that's my supervisor asked. I actually don't know. I've never clicked submit on a grant. I've written lots of grants. I've gotten lots of grants, but I was at a big university that did it for me. But not everybody has those opportunities. So I found the gap that like, well, maybe institutionally we can support these non-R1 universities that don't have it. So like understanding, oh, there's a cultural gap, right? That's something that really helps to bring full circle. Because sometimes, a lot of time, you're maybe the only PhD in the room, which is a little scary.
I would say don't be afraid to expand beyond your subject matter expertise. I think as a PhD, you're focused on like such a narrow set of issues and you're used to kind of being an expert in that. But as a PhD, like one of the main things, you learn how to learn. So you'll be able to jump into a different subject matter area and figure it out. So I wouldn't be intimidated by that. And I think that's one of the things that the fellowship is designed to let you do. Because it's a really unique opportunity. If I had just applied to be a Fed in my office, like I definitely don't have the relevant background that they would be looking for in a federal hire, but they're kind of willing to take you on as a fellow anyway and kind of accept that, yeah, you don't really know what you're doing right now, but you'll be able to figure it out.
Wonderful. Well, we are at the hour, and I think given everything you all just said, those are perfect notes to end on. So I just want to thank our speakers so much for the time you've given us today, and thank you for sharing your experiences and wisdom and your experiences with everyone on this session. In the coming days, we will send a recording of this chat and resources to support your STPF application. We hope you can join us on October 13th for Ask a Fellow Anything. It'll be the final chat before the application deadline, which again is on November 1st. If we couldn't get to your question today, you can email us at fellowships@AAAS.org or reply to any of our live chat emails. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all again, and goodbye.